Somewhere in the sand of a desert in western China, archaeologists lifted a body out of the ground barely a meter down, and what came up was not bone. They had not found a skeleton. It was a face. The eyelashes were still there. The lines of the skin were still there. An expression still sat on it after 4,000 years, and the face was wrong. A high, narrow nose, deep-set eyes, hair the color of straw and rust, in the dead center of Asia, buried more than 1,000 years before anyone the written record accounts for ever set foot in that basin. For a century, everyone agreed on the same answer. These were strangers who came from somewhere else. Then, in 2021, their own DNA said the opposite. And the truth it gave up was stranger than the mystery it had replaced. There is a desert in western China called the Taklamakan, and its name carries a warning built into the word itself. It translates roughly as the place you enter but never leave. That is not poetry. That is a practical instruction handed down by people who watched others walk in and never come back out. It sits inside the Tarim Basin, the largest inland basin in China, a vast bowl of sand and salt sealed off by mountains on every side. Somewhere within it lies the dried bed of Lop Nur, a lake that vanished into crust and dust, a place the Chinese state would later use for nuclear testing. Mountains that lock the rain out. A lake that gave up and died. Ground so poisoned with salt that almost nothing grows in it. Nothing about this landscape suggests preservation. Everything about it suggests erasure. And yet it has preserved the dead better than almost anywhere on Earth. The reason is not embalming, it is chemistry. The air out there is brutally dry and the soil is heavy with salt, and together the two of them pulled the moisture out of bodies laid in that ground until the flesh simply desiccated in place. No ritual, no technique, no intention at all, just a chemical accident repeated over and over for thousands of years. These are not mummies in the Egyptian sense. No one prepared them. No one drew out their organs or wrapped them in linen or painted their coffins with spells to carry them through the next world. There was no priesthood standing over the body, no craft, no instruction. The desert did the work by accident, drawing the water out so completely that eyelashes survived, skin lines survived, the fine hair on a forearm survived, thousands of years after the arm stopped moving. That is the strange bargain of the Taklamakan. The same conditions that make it uninhabitable are the exact conditions that keep a body whole. The landscape that kills is the landscape that remembers. Anywhere else on Earth, 4,000 years takes everything. It takes the skin first, then the hair, then the cloth, then the bone, until all that is left for anyone to find is a shape in the dirt and a handful of fragments. Out there, 4,000 years takes almost nothing. And that matters more than it sounds. A skeleton gives you measurements, it gives you a rough age, a height, a guess at the rest. But a body with its hair still on it, with the cloth it was buried in still wrapped around it, gives you the person. What they wore, how they cut their hair, what somebody thought to lay beside them the day they went into the ground. The first of these bodies to seize the world's attention came up in 1980. A team of Chinese archaeologists was working near Lop Nur, filming a documentary about the Silk Road. They were not hunting for this. Nobody was, and barely a meter beneath the surface they found a woman, wrapped in wool and felt, and the dating placed her at roughly 1,800 years before the Common Era. Her face was intact. Her expression was intact. She had been lying in that sand for close to 4,000 years, and she still had an expression. They called her the Beauty of Lulan, and she went around the world. She became the photograph, the one image everybody had seen, the body that made the Tarim Basin famous. And she was not the important one, because the richer discovery, the one that turned a striking photograph into a problem the field could not put down, lay much further out. About 120 kilometers west and slightly south, deeper into the dune country, out where reaching the site at all meant crossing open sand with nothing on the horizon in any direction. What was waiting there was not one woman with an intact face. It was hundreds of them. The site is called Xiaohe, the small river cemetery number 5, and sometimes it goes by another name, Ordex Necropolis. It lies about 120 kilometers west and slightly south of Lulan, out where there is no road and no landmark to steer by, and reaching it means crossing open dune country. Nobody stumbles onto this place. You have to be going there. Systematic excavation began there in the early 2000s, and what it opened up was one of the strangest burial grounds ever recorded anywhere. You see it before you reach it. Standing up out of the sand is a forest of tall wooden posts, hundreds of them, driven into a low mound in the middle of an empty plain of sand. Some are plain, some are carved into shapes. And this is where it is worth being careful, because archaeologists have read those shapes through the lens of burial practice rather than any belief we can confirm. The posts are real. The meaning of them is reconstruction. Nobody who put them there left a note explaining why. Then you go under the sand, and the bodies are lying inside hollowed wooden coffins shaped like boats and sealed with hide. Boats. In the middle of a waterless desert. Whatever else is uncertain about this place, that shape was not an accident. Somebody hollowed those coffins out on purpose, curved the sides on purpose, and laid their dead inside a vessel shaped for water in one of the driest corners of the world. Among the dead was a woman who came to be called the Beauty of Xiaohe. She still had her lashes. She still had her hair. She was wearing a white hat of felted wool, a woolen cloak, and boots lined with fur, and beside her lay small pouches of a plant called ephedra, tucked in close to the body. Stop on that for a second, because it is the detail that collapses the distance. That is not a burial. That is an outfit. Somebody dressed her. Somebody chose the hat, fitted the boots, pulled the cloak closed, and stood back and looked at her before the coffin went into the ground. 4,000 years later, you are looking at the same arrangement they left. But what made the necropolis extraordinary was not any single body. It was the accumulation, not one woman, not a handful. Hundreds of individuals, preserved down to the strands of their hair, dressed in woven cloth, laid in shaped coffins under carved posts, buried with care across generations in a place that should have been uninhabitable. This was not a camp where a few people died. This was a community with a cemetery, which means a community with time, with continuity, with children who grew up burying their parents the way their parents had buried theirs. Whole generations of them lived out there in the salt and the sand, long enough to develop a tradition and hold on to it. And the ordinary things came up with them. Not gold, not thrones, not the treasure that fills a museum hall and sells a ticket. Baskets, cord, grain, cloth with the weave still readable. The things a household uses without thinking about them, sitting exactly where somebody set them down. Excavators had opened one of the best preserved windows into the Bronze Age that exists anywhere on the planet, and instead of answering anything, every single body they lifted out of that mound raised the same quiet problem the moment the sand came off it. They did not look like the desert around them. They did not look like the people who live in that region today, and they did not look like the people history says arrived there later. They looked like they had wandered in from another world entirely, and the sand had simply kept them, waiting for somebody to come along and explain them. And for the next 40 years, that is exactly what the field tried to do. The problem was in their faces. When the bodies came out of the sand, they did not carry the features anyone expected to find in the heart of Asia. They were often tall, their eye sockets were deep set, their noses were high and narrow, and their hair ran from flaxen through to a deep rust red, preserved strand by the dry, salt ground. To the first researchers standing over them, these looked like people who belonged thousands of kilometers to the west. And yet here they were, buried in the driest corner of western China, in the geographic center of a continent. And these are not reconstructions. This is not an artist's impression built out of a skull and a set of measurements. The hair is the hair, The nose is the nose. You are looking at what the people standing at the graveside looked at 4,000 years ago, before anyone shoveled the sand back over the top of them. The clothing deepened the puzzle rather than solving it. These were not people dressed in rough hides scraped together for survival. They were dressed in woven wool, some of it patterned with twill and checks that reminded observers of textiles produced far away in Central Europe. Cloth that spoke of looms, cloth that spoke of skill and of a tradition somebody had learned from somebody else. There were felt hats, carefully shaped, and one man was reportedly buried alongside a whole range of them. This was material culture with a sense of style. Not survival gear, not the bare minimum a body needs to get through a winter. Choices. Made by people in a landscape where nothing in the surroundings explained where the knowledge to make any of it had come from. Then there are the objects laid beside the dead. Sprigs and small pouches of ephedra appear again and again in these graves, tucked in close to the bodies. The plant has known properties, and researchers have offered readings of why it was placed there, medicinal or ceremonial. But those are interpretations reconstructed from context, not anything the people themselves left us to confirm. What can be stated plainly is that the placement was deliberate. Somebody chose to bury their dead with it, and they did it consistently across the whole cemetery for generations. And this was not a curiosity to be noted and set aside. It was a genuine problem. These people were living deep in the Tarim Basin more than 1,000 years before the Silk Road opened the region to long-distance trade, centuries before the Han Chinese established themselves there, well before the Uyghur populations who live in that region today ever arrived. They predated almost everyone the written record accounts for, and to the eyes examining them, they looked like they had no business being there at all. The scholar who did the most to bring these bodies to the attention of the world outside China was Victor Mayer, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, who encountered them and could not let the question go. And it was the obvious question, the one anyone would ask, standing over a 4,000-year-old woman with red hair and a felt hat in the middle of a Chinese desert. How did people who looked like this end up in a place like this? And where on earth had they come from? The faces demanded a westward answer. Everything about the first impression pointed outward, toward migration, toward some long journey from a distant homeland that had carried these people and their looms and their hats across half a continent to die in the sand. It seemed almost self-evident. Faces that out of place had to mean movement from somewhere else. And so, for decades, that is exactly what the leading theories set out to explain. Not whether these people had come from somewhere. That part was settled before anyone started. Only which road they had taken to get here. Every serious theory started from the same assumption. These people came from somewhere else. The only real disagreement was the route. One explanation pointed north, to the Afanasyevo, a Bronze Age herding culture out of the steppe country around the Altai Mountains. In this version, associated with the work of scholars including Mallory and Meyer, the Tarim people descended from steppe migrants who pushed south into the basin, and they may have carried with them Tocharian, an extinct branch of the Indo-European language family that would later be attested in the region. It was a clean story. Herders move, herders spread. The language and the faces travel together, down out of the mountains and into the sand. A second explanation looked southwest instead, to Central Asia, to the oasis civilization known as the Bactria-Margiana Archaeological Complex, a sophisticated network of irrigated settlements. In this reading, the Tarim founders arrived from those cultures, bringing farming and craft with them. A third pointed to the inner Asian mountain corridor, the string of high valleys and pastures that could have funneled populations down into the basin from the north and the west. 3 theories, 3 different maps, and every single one of them drew an arrow pointing inward, toward the Tarim, from outside. The genetic evidence available at the time only muddied things further. Samples reportedly smuggled out of the country in the early 1990s were said to show links to European ancestry. Then, later, a team led by Li Jin at Fudan University reported in the 2000s a more mixed picture, one that included East Asian and even South Asian genetic markers among the remains. That finding was contested. Mayer and others disputed it, and the overall evidentiary picture stayed unsettled. A set of partial results pointing in different directions and resolving into no clear answer at all. But there was a second reason this question sat unresolved for so long, and it had nothing to do with science. The mummies had become political. To many Uyghur communities in the region, these ancient bodies were ancestors, and their presence was taken as proof of a prior claim to the land, a rooting in the Tarim that ran deeper than later arrivals. The Chinese state grew wary of exactly that argument. Access to the remains tightened. Foreign researchers found it increasingly difficult to study the bodies directly, and the science became entangled with the dispute over who belonged to that region and for how long. None of that is a matter this account can settle, and it is worth stating plainly that the archaeology and the modern politics are two separate questions that became very difficult to keep apart. But the practical consequence is easy enough to state. The one test that could have ended the argument was the one test almost nobody was in a position to run. So this was the state of play as the 21st century opened. A world-famous mystery, a set of striking bodies with Western faces lying in a Chinese desert. Several competing theories, each proposing a different homeland and a different journey, each one assuming these people were newcomers. Decades of argument conducted entirely on the surface of the problem, on the shape of a nose and the pattern of a cloth and the location of a mountain pass. And underneath all of it, a set of remains that almost no one outside China was permitted to test with the tools that might have decided the matter. The question of where the Tarim people came from had been debated for the better part of a century without resolution, and every year it was argued in the same terms, because the only terms available were the ones you could see. What was needed was a way to read the answer directly out of the bodies themselves. From the one record that could not be argued into a homeland, it did not have. That record was their DNA, and it had never been properly read. The answer arrived in October of 2021 in the journal Nature in a paper titled The Genomic Origins of the Bronze Age Tarim Basin Mummies. It was led by a researcher named Fan Zhang, working with an international team that included Christina Warrener, an anthropologist affiliated with Harvard and the Max Planck Institute, and Chungwan Zhang, an evolutionary geneticist who had spent years pursuing exactly this question. For the first time, someone was going to read the founding population of the Tarim directly out of their own genomes. The scope was careful, and it matters that it was careful. The team recovered genome-wide data from 13 of the earliest individuals in the basin, 11 of them drawn from the Xiaohe cemetery itself, along with 5 more from the neighboring Dzungarian basin to the north. These were not scattered latecomers. These were not the people who wandered in at the end of the story and got buried on top of everybody else. They were among the oldest people the region has produced, dating to roughly the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era. The founders, the very people every theory had spent a century trying to explain, and the logic going in was simple. Zhang laid it out plainly. Where there is migration, there are genes. If these people had come from the west, from the Afanasyevo steppe, from the Central Asian oases, from the mountain corridor, from anywhere at all, that homeland would have left a signature written into their DNA. Populations do not move without carrying themselves with them. Find the signature and you find the road they traveled. All the team had to do was read it. The road did not exist. There was no detectable Western steppe ancestry in these people, no Afanasyevo signal, none of the genetic fingerprints that a migration from the west or the north would have stamped into them, anywhere in the data. 3 theories had spent decades arguing over which journey these people had made, and the genomes came back with a verdict that fit none of them. Not a weaker version of one, not a compromise between 2. None. Because the Tarim founders had not come from somewhere else at all. They were a genetically isolated local population, descended from people who had already been living in and around that region since the early Holocene, thousands of years before the graves were dug, before the boat coffins, before the felt hats, before the woven cloth. They were not travelers who ended up in the Tarim. They were the Tarim, and they had been there the entire time. The composition itself was striking. Roughly 72% of their ancestry traced to a lineage geneticists call Ancient North Eurasian. The remaining 28% came from an ancient Northeast Asian source. 2 ingredients. That is the whole recipe. No European contribution, no steppe herders, no oasis farmers folded into the mix. And here's the part that should stop you. Around them, in that same Bronze Age, the neighboring populations were mixing freely, trading genes back and forth across the region in every direction the map allows. Peoples met, married, absorbed each other, and moved on. That is what the Bronze Age looks like almost everywhere you sample it. The Tarim people were not doing that. They sat in the middle of all that movement and stayed sealed, marrying among themselves, absorbing no one. Generation after generation, while the traffic went around them on every side, they kept their own line and let nothing in. A genetic island in a landscape full of traffic. So the genomes did not answer the question that had been asked for 100 years. They erased it. There was no route to find because there had been no arrival to trace. The migration everybody was mapping never happened. But that only sharpened the real problem into something harder. Because if they never came from anywhere, the faces still had to be explained. The question was no longer where these people had traveled from. It was who they were descended from. The answer runs back to a population that has almost entirely vanished from the earth. Geneticists call them the Ancient North Eurasians, and they were hunter-gatherers of the Siberian interior during the last ice age, a people who spread across the cold heart of the continent and then, as the glaciers retreated, faded from the record almost everywhere they had been. For a long time, nobody knew they had existed at all. They were a gap, a shape that other populations seemed to require, but that had never been seen directly, an absence you could only detect by the hole it left in everybody else. Then a body gave them a face. Near Lake Baikal in Siberia lies a site called Malta, and buried there was the body of a child, a boy who died roughly 24,000 years ago at the height of the last glacial maximum, when ice covered much of the northern world. His remains had been recovered decades earlier, in the 1920s, and they sat in a collection while the question they answered had not even been asked yet. It was a team led by Eske Willerslev in Copenhagen that finally sequenced his genome and published the result. The boy, known as MA1, turned out to belong to a population that science had suspected but never confirmed. A ghost made real. The reason they are called a ghost population is that they left almost no whole descendants, and yet their DNA is scattered across the modern world. A substantial share of Native American ancestry traces back to them, by some estimates between 14 and 38%. Up to a fifth of the ancestry of many Europeans runs to the same source. This vanished Ice Age people threaded their genes into populations on opposite sides of the planet, peoples who never met and never mixed, and then the source itself disappeared, surviving mostly as fragments inside others. And this is what the Tarim mummies turned out to be. Not strangers from the West. They were among the best surviving representatives of that lost lineage anywhere on Earth, a pocket of an Ice Age ghost population preserved in the sand of a Chinese desert, thousands of years after the people who produced them had gone from nearly everywhere else. The faces that looked so out of place were not out of place at all. They were old, older than any migration theory had ever reached for, a deep survival that the desert happened to keep. And then there is the paradox the same study uncovered, because these people were sealed off by blood and wide open by culture. Their teeth told part of it. Traces of milk proteins in the hardened plaque showed they were dairy herders from the very beginning, and their diet braided the whole of Eurasia together. Wheat and dairy that came from West Asia, millet that came from the East, ephedra drawn from Central Asia. They borrowed farming, herding, and medicine from every direction the compass offered, and married none of the people who brought it. They took the world's technology and kept their own bloodline untouched. Isolation and cosmopolitanism, which sound like opposites, turn out to describe the same population at the same time. What a people borrow and who a people are can be two entirely separate records. But the answer did not close every question, and it is worth being honest about what stays open. The matter of language is unresolved. Whether these people spoke Proto-Tocharian cannot be established from their DNA. Elizabeth Wayland Barber has cautioned against assuming it, pointing to a gap of roughly 1,000 years between the mummies and the first attested Tocharian, more than enough time for a language to arrive without the people changing. Others, including the linguist Ronald Kim, have argued the timing could still fit, and the study sampled essentially one horizon at one site. As the geneticist Vagish Narasimhan noted, wider sampling across the basin could complicate the picture. The beginning is certain now. The middle and the end are still being read. Return to the desert and to the bodies it kept. The beauty of Lulan. The beauty of Xiaohe. Faces intact after 3,000 and 4,000 years, still wearing their felt hats, still framed by hair the color of straw and rust. For a century they were treated as strangers who wandered in from somewhere far away, a mystery of migration waiting to be traced. Their own DNA revealed something stranger. They were not travelers who arrived. They were survivors who stayed, long after the world that made them was gone. The last of a ghost lineage out of the Ice Age that now survives mostly as fragments of code carried inside billions of us, and almost nowhere as a whole. And the desert still holds what it has not yet given up. So what happened to them in the end? Drop your theory below and click the next video, because the sand is still being read.